Hi, welcome back. In this session, I'd like to complete my discussion of user-based businesses that I started more than a year ago. About a year ago, I tried my first user-based valuation. What am I talking about? Well, the standard way in which you approach valuing a company is you aggregate the company. You look at total revenues, total earnings, total cash flows, and you derive a total value for the company. And I was taken to task when I valued Uber using that approach, saying, hey, I was missing the point. I was told that in the new economy, companies built their value around users and subscribers, and a good valuation model, therefore, has to start from those users and subscribers and build up. My initial reaction was defensive, but there was a point there, and I took it to heart and I valued Uber riders first, and I used that approach to value Amazon Prime members and Spotify and Netflix subscribers. I have learned along the way, and I have learned some new things about user based valuation that I think will stand me in good stead on future user based companies. In fact, I was reminded of those posts over the last couple of weeks. First, when I posted on Walmart acquiring Flipkart, the Indian online retailer, for 21 billion. This is a company that lost a billion, has 3 billion revenues, but has one thing going for it: lots of shoppers. Then I read a news story about MoviePass, a product that's probably too good to be true, where you can pay $10 a month, watch as many movies as you want, and the travails that the company offering that product is facing. And finally, on my way home a few days ago, I tripped over a Lime bike, a dockless bike. This is the new business model that seems to be exploding all over the country. So let's step back and think about what the drivers of user based value are. It is true that in traditional valuation, we build up to total revenues. Those revenues come from users and subscribers. And perhaps in this new economy, where companies do measure success based on the number of users, the number of subscribers they have, it might be time for us to think about building up to value from a user, valuing an existing user, valuing a new user, and coming up to a total value for a user based company. To do this, the first thing you need to do is value an existing user. Easier said than done, because here are the inputs you need. First, you need to estimate how much cash flow you will generate per user. Let's cut down to brass tacks. No matter how much you detest old economy numbers, ultimately you cannot pay dividends with users. Users have to generate cash flows for you, which means you have to generate revenues from users and net out the expenses that you expend to service those revenues. You have to estimate how long a user is going to stay on a user, which means that you have to come up with renewal rates and churn rates, the number of users you drop off every year. And you also have to estimate how much you can grow your cash flows. Finally, you discount those cash flows back at a risk-adjusted rate. If that sounds familiar, I told you cannot run away from fundamentals just because you're valuing a user-based company. The net effect of this is you can come up with the value of an existing user. You multiply by the number of users you have. You have the first block in valuation, which is the value of existing users. You're saying, what else is that? Well, your company is continuing to acquire users, right? So you have to value new users. To value new users, you start with what you have as a value of an existing user, and then you net out the cost of acquiring a new user. That might be a little riskier than keeping existing users, but you take the present value of those added new users over time. You got the second block, which is the value of new users. Finally, you got to wrap up loose ends. What are those loose ends? You might have some costs that have nothing to do with users, that are unrelated to users. You can't ignore those costs. It can include costs like G&A, but in the case of Netflix, it was content cost. And you have to bring those costs into the process by taking the present value of those costs. You bring those costs in, and that's going to reduce your value. You have your overall value for a user-based company. As I said, that's the approach I use to value Uber, Amazon Prime, Spotify, and Netflix. And while the standard critique of traditional valuation is that we're focused on cash flows, growth, and risk, note that even in a user-based valuation, I'm still focused on cash flows, growth, and risk. The difference is I'm building up to those cash flows, growth, and risk through users rather than from the top down. But here are some interesting insights that I was able to eke out of my valuations of user-based companies, and I'm glad I went down this path. Here's the first thing. A lot of old time value investors look at user-based companies and say those companies are useless because they lose money. Well, that's a very shallow critique, because a lot of these user-based companies are still young and they're losing money not because they're user-based companies, but because they're young companies. There are good ways. This is going to sound strange. There are good ways of losing money and bad ways of losing money. So if you're looking at a user-based company, looking at the cost structure can give you some insight into how valuable that user-based company will be. For instance, if the bulk of the costs at a user-based company are going to service existing users, that's a bad sign. You'd much rather that the bulk of the costs go to acquiring new users because those new users will create future growth. Second, if you're looking at a user-based company, especially if it's a growing company, you want the fixed cost to be a high percentage of your cost. Why? Because you want economies of scale kicking in. If you're a mature company, that might turn against you, but as a growing company, having higher fixed costs will allow you to get more value as you as you increase the number of users you have. So from a cost structure, you'd much rather have a user-based company spending money to acquire new users and have a lot of fixed costs. In terms of growth, if you look at the value of growth is greater from getting existing users to buy more from you than going after new users. And the reason is a very simple one. When you get existing users to spend more, it's like icing on the cake. You already have those users. You don't have to spend more money to get them. Whereas if you have to go after new users, there's an acquisition cost. So if you're growing, I'd much rather that you be able to grow with existing users as opposed to constantly going after new users. Secondly, the cost of new user acquisition is a factor as well. I'd much rather that you be a company with low cost to acquire new users than one that has to spend incredible amounts. Again, because you got to make that amount back for new users to add value. At the risk of sounding obsolete or strange or old, you can add new users and increase value. You can add new users and do nothing for value. You can add new users and actually destroy value if the cost of acquiring new users is high enough. So as an example, let's look at Netflix versus Spotify, both companies that are valued using user-based models. Netflix has more subscribers, but the real difference comes about when you look at how much of Netflix's expenses goes to servicing existing users and how much goes towards new users and fixed costs. Netflix has a fixed cost for content. Spotify pays for content as people listen. What that does is it makes content costs a variable cost for Spotify, a user-related cost. 79% of their revenues go to covering content costs. The total cost that Netflix faces for servicing existing subscribers is only 19%. You're saying, so what? It means that Netflix, when it looks at its existing users, because so much of the value, is so much of the cost is fixed cost, most of the revenue they get from existing users goes into value, which means that existing users and new users are worth a lot more to Netflix than to Spotify. There is a risk in the Netflix model, and the risk comes about from the fact that they have huge fixed costs, and if things go bad, there's a much bigger downside to Netflix. Spotify has a less risky, lower upside model. Netflix has a more risky, higher upside model. Finally, when you look at revenue models, there are three basic revenue models you can use as a user-based company to generate your cash flows. The first is a subscription-based model. That's what Netflix and Spotify have. The second is an advertising model. Advertising models use your users, collect data on the users, and use it to target advertising. Google and Facebook are classic examples, but even within this space, you can see Pandora is tilted more towards an advertising model, even though it's a music streaming company just like Spotify. And finally, you have transaction models. These are models where the users actually have to transact for you to make money. Uber's users don't generate revenue for it if they don't use the app. Amazon Prime's users, Amazon Prime as a hybrid model. It collects some of its revenues in subscriptions, but its Prime members also buy a lot more than typical members. So you can have subscription models, advertising models, transaction models, or some version of a hybrid model. So we are differentiating across user-based companies. Here's a matrix that lets you differentiate between great companies, average companies, good companies, and mediocre companies. Here's what a great company pulls off. It has high value for existing users and somehow has managed to lower the cost of adding new users. So that's your great company. These are the stars. They're the companies that will have the highest value. If you have a high value for an existing user and you're spending a lot for a new user, well, you have an exclusive user model, a kind of premium model. Fine, that could make you a good company. Or you can have a model where you have a low value per existing user, but and the cost of new users is also low. You have lots of users, you have a commoditized model. But here's the combination you don't want to have. If you get a low value per user and it costs you a lot to acquire new users, you got a mediocre company. And that's really the advantage of looking at user-based models. It allows you to differentiate across companies. You see, well, how do these great companies become great? It sounds too good to be true. How do you get high value per existing user and a low cost for acquiring new users? Here's where some buzzwords actually become business words. Heard about network benefits, right? The network benefits of a company reflect the fact that as it gets bigger, it gets easier for it to get bigger. How does this show up in my model? As a company adds more new users, it actually gets easier to get new users. The cost of new users goes up. So if you're a company with real network benefits, you'll see the cost of adding new users actually decreases as you get bigger. You go to big data. It gets thrown around a lot, a buzzword, but if it's meant to measure what it does, it is data that you're collecting as a company that's exclusive to you, that allows you to sell your existing users more stuff. Amazon Prime is a classic example. Big data allows you to get more value from existing users. Network benefits allows you to lower the cost of a new user if you have both big data and network benefits working for you, which is what Netflix and Amazon Prime do. You can see why you become an incredibly valuable company. All said though, when I look at user-based companies and the numbers attached to these companies, I'm inclined to believe that there's a pricing game going on, where both investors and founders are dancing a dance, where the founders point to the number of users they have, and the investors price them on the users, and they hope there's a bigger fool at the end of this game that they can flip this company to based on the number of users. Looking at the drivers of user value actually will let you decide which user-based companies you should avoid. And the user-based companies I would avoid share the following characteristics. The companies talk about users, users, users. That's all they talk about. There's never a talk about revenue models or earnings or cash flows. It's all about users all the time. The second is these same companies that want you to give them high prices or market values because of the users are remarkably opaque about telling you much about their users. They don't tell you much about renewal rates, churn rates, the kinds of things you need to value the users. Third, these companies often have bad business models. You look at those models and you say, how the heck can you build a business on this? So these are models that are bad business models, not just now, but continue to scale up to become even worse business models, which effectively means there are no economies of scale. There's a lot of loose talk about data. So these user-based businesses tell you that they're going to collect data, and then they say that they will use the data to make money, but they're not clear about why the data they collect is exclusive and how it will be monetized. And finally, these companies often also talk about how they're changing the underlying business by giving a new way of doing it and how this is going to expand the underlying business, and that there are going to be all kinds of beneficiaries that emerge from it who will then share their spoils with the user-based company. Again, it's not quite clear why they would, but that's you take it on trust. So here's a good example of a company that met all five of these criteria. You might have heard of MoviePass. This is the product where you you get a subscription, you pay $10 a month, and effectively you get to watch as many movies, actually a movie a day, every day for 30 days, if you wanted to, up to a movie a day. So you pay $10, and already you can see the why people think this is too good to be true. The average price for a movie ticket in the US is about $8.79. In the cities, it could be 12 or 15. If you're paying $10 a month, you go to one movie. That's it. You're already you've got your subscription back. If you go to two movies, MoviePass has to pay the theaters full price. So if you go to 5 movies, they're losing $40 on you. So it's when you describe this model, you can already see it's a bad business model. Of course, MoviePass has had all kinds of reasons why it's going to work. One excuse that was given by the CEO was that over time people would stop watching that many movies. They'll settle into watching one movie a year, one movie a month, and therefore, so if your best case scenario is you'll break even, that nobody will use your product or your service that much, that's not a great end game. Or you're told that there will be data collected that could be monetized. What's the data you're collecting of what movies I'm watching? Well, there are a lot of people who collect that data who know where I am. I'm not sure there's anything exclusive about this data or that anybody will pay for it. Finally, we're told that theater owners and small studios will benefit from MoviePass, and that's absolutely true. MoviePass is going to pull more people into the movies. But neither the theater owners nor the small studios are in any position financially to share spoils with you. Theater owners are teetering on the edge of disaster. Small studios need every dollar they collect. So every opt out that MoviePass gives you as to why their model will work, you look at it and say that's not going to happen. And the predictable and in April of 2018, MoviePass had 2 million subscribers. No surprise, it's too good to be true. You're going to subscribe. I'd love to be a subscriber to MoviePass, but it was burning through $20 million in cash. You're saying, so what? The predictable consequence is about a year ago, a company called Helios and Matheson, a supposedly data analytics firm, which gives both data and analysis a bad name, acquired MoviePass. And that's when they lowered the price to $10 and they said they were going to go after the data. Well, you can see what's happened to H&M stock price. It's now down to almost zero. And you know what? My question is, what took it so long? The bottom line is MoviePass built as is not a viable business. It never was. You're saying maybe they can find a way to wiggle out. They might, but it's a little too late. You have to think about pathways to profitability right from the beginning. You can't say, let's wait a couple of years, acquire the users, and then change our business model. It doesn't work that way. So the bottom line is you can build a valuable user-based company. And we know that Netflix and Amazon Prime have moved far along this path. The most valuable user-based companies have found a way to use network benefits and big data. Network benefits lower the cost of acquiring new users, and big data to actually sell more stuff to existing users or tailor content to them as Netflix has. But a combination of hubris and laziness has led to a lot of bad user-based companies whose only selling pitch seems to be, we have lots of users. And they have investors who seem to not care that they have bad business models, and founders who don't seem to have the energy or the time to develop these business models. Those are the companies that will crash and burn. And the sooner they go down, the better off we'll be. Thank you very much for listening.